Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm here with my first episode of the new year to discuss yet another wonderful entry in the Wise Blood books collection. I've had the publisher Joshua Wren on before to discuss the work that this press does, publishing a lot of wonderful Catholic fiction and essays. And today I have with me the author of a new work of fiction and a new essay from Wise Blood. The novel is Minor Indignities. The essay published as a booklet, which I'll hold up. Actually, I'll hold both of these up in front of the camera here. Here's the novel, Minor Indignities. And here is the essay published in booklet form, The Situation of the Catholic Novelist. These are both written by Trevor Cribben Merrill, who is my guest today. We'll be discussing both of these. The novel I enjoyed very much, and I'm excited to talk about it. Trevor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Thomas. Delighted to be here.
My understanding is that this is sort of a genre to itself, the sort of the university experience novel. I haven't read any of the other entries in this genre, but is there sort of a tradition you're working in here?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, arguably, one of the first Catholic novels, Newman's Loss and Gain, is also the first campus novel.
Right.
And the campus novel does have it is sort of a genre unto itself. But I've got to say, I as I was writing this, I was not aware of working in the genre of the campus novel. And it was only after other people told me that that's what I had done that I realized that instead of writing the 21st century's answer to Brideshead Revisited, a conversion story, I had actually just written a campus novel, which came as something of a surprise.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I can see, aspects of both in there, certainly. But well, this is a novel that's very evocative of the undergraduate Ivy League experience. And it does a great job of evoking the sort of air of frivolous pseudo-intellectualism and licentiousness that, one might expect. And although I am not very familiar personally with the Ivy League experience, I've picked up enough of what it's like by osmosis, meeting people who have gone to these schools and things like that, that it feels very, very real. And the book, it's about these students. They're reading all of these, heady works in school. They're discussing ideas, but it never really feels like a novel of ideas, which I liked. It wears that aspect very lightly, as it should, because the students themselves are not necessarily real intellectuals, in most cases. So mostly what I enjoyed about it, and I really kind of plowed through it as soon as I started reading it, it's very, very readable, is sort of how real in its atmosphere and in its psychological detail the book is. Could you maybe go into just maybe a brief sort of synopsis, not a synopsis, but just tell people what it's about, essentially?
Sure. So the novel is about a young man from Maine, from New England, who is going away to college, and he's leaving his small town behind. And he arrives on the campus of an unnamed university, which is an Ivy League university, but I deliberately didn't want the book to be about any specific university. And he arrives there. He's quite naive and inexperienced. He has some of the traits of a sort of typical, I suppose, overachieving freshman who belonged to a lot of clubs and works very hard to get good grades in school. Didn't have a lot of extracurricular experiences or maybe the best social skills. And he arrives in this place where the students are forbiddingly sophisticated. Some of them are from New York and have gone to elite prep schools. and many of them are very comfortable swimming in the sea of a hookup and party culture that he's never encountered before. And he gets involved on the really the first night that he's on campus with a young woman, a fellow freshman, uh, and and he has also has met on a freshman orientation trip another fellow freshman, another young woman, and the novel sort of charts his hesitations and flirtations and amorous suffering in his relationships with these two young women, while at the same time uh, charting his relationships with his friends and his roommates, and in particular, a young guy from the Midwest whose parents own a restaurant and who's on the golf team and who's sort of a very genuine and sincere and unusually mature young person, and then another figure who's more of a rival to the main character Colin, and who is intellectually very sophisticated and quite precocious in his understanding both of books and I suppose of life, but at the same time very self-deluding and willfully eccentric.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, well, the novel opens with a scene that's very familiar, in movies, TV shows, books, like the guy leaving behind his high school girlfriend to go to
right.
college. And the dynamic is very familiar to all of us, I think, where she is perhaps more interested in continuing a long distance relationship than he is. And many of the experiences in the book feel familiar, but it's the specificity and the detail with which they're evoked that I really enjoyed. And then the way that you zero in on this guy's failure to be himself, this guy, his fear of being himself around others, his constant, I mean, we all have this, but really pathological fear of human respect, and the thinking that people are observing his slightest motion of a fork at dinner, at all times. And that is where sort of a lot of the sort of the moral journey and the development of the character comes in. The epigraph, if I'm getting the right word there, to the book is a quote from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux: "Humiliation is the way to humility." And that really sort of ends up being the character's journey. At a certain point, he's pursuing this girl you mentioned, who kind of flirts with him on the first night of school. Then is somewhat seemingly indifferent to him for a while. Then they end up hooking up for a while, and then she's indifferent to him again. And he's obsessively thinking about her, essentially stalking her for a while. And at a certain point, probably in the last third of the book, you are just looking on with horror as this guy just makes more and more of an idiot of himself. Not that he's really sort of becomes a dangerous character exactly, but he is making a fool of himself, and that is sort of the uh, the turning point. This humiliation that he ultimately gets hit with is sort of his moral turning point. But the title of the novel is Minor Indignities, and there's a certain gentleness, even though any of us having gotten ourselves into the situation he gets himself into would be mortified, you know. But in the end, um, what happens to him isn't all that bad. You know what I mean? And you even note in the book, because he's basically called to account for stalking this girl. You note in the book, the consequences of just a few years later might have been much worse. But in this era, I guess it's in the 90s. Um,
yeah, the late '90s, early 2000s. The novel's set in the year 2000, really,
I see.
uh, the year of the tech bubble bursts. Uh,
Right.
yeah,
So at this time, it's still he didn't really hurt anybody, and that's understood. It's understood this guy's not a monster. If it doesn't go any further, if he learns his lesson, then it's fine. So that's something. There's a little bit of backward-looking consciousness there, in these sort of narrators, or in the it's a first person in his own comments on the situation that he was in. But it's just interesting. There's the book is about things that are really very morally consequential. I mean, the hookup culture, the abuse of the intellect, fear of human respect, failing to be oneself, pretension, all these different things. These are all morally consequential, but it wears it. I feel like it wears these things very lightly, and that's part of the charm and the appeal of the novel.
Well, I'm obviously delighted to hear you say that. And since we've been discussing the stalking plot, this might be a good time for me to say that the novel is not autobiographical, at least
I was
not
going
in the
to ask
strict,
about that.
at least not in the strict sense. Though of course, obviously, I had to use many of my own memories to write it, and the dilemmas, particularly what you're saying about human respect. That the character is confronted with. I mean, there's obviously not foreign to me. I don't think they're foreign to anyone really, but there's certainly things that have been of concern to me, and that I cared deeply about, and wanted to try to represent in literary form. But I'm really happy to hear you say that the novel wears its moral questions and questioning lightly, because I wanted to write something that uh, did deal with uh, serious matters. Uh, but I think I'm sort of persuaded by the idea that the sort of the literary form of Catholicism, the Catholic novel, is somehow predisposed to the comic.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to write something, even if there is maybe this is a flaw in the novel. There is a sense in which maybe you cringe a little bit too much at times, because the situations are sort of intrinsically embarrassing at times, and the character himself is very self-conscious. He's trapped in this kind of hell of always wondering what other people are thinking of him. But I wanted the novel, despite that sort of cringe element, to be enjoyable to read, and to be ultimately sort of an entertainment of a sort, so that whatever instruction it might have to impart. And I should say that my aim was not to write a book that would have some kind of lesson or edifying moral to convey. But I wanted those questions to come across in a kind of, I guess, just for them to be imbued in the literary material itself, instead of being tacked on.
Now, you were talking about, Brideshead Revisited, and how you had conceived this as being sort of a successor to that in some way. Um, uh, I'm trying to think of like where I would see that in the book. I mean, there's the aspect that this young man is an aspiring writer, which he sort of keeps a secret, and this is sort of awakened by his friendships to some extent, as particularly his friendship with Julia, who's sort of one of the people who actually encourages it. Um, and obviously there's a couple of names. Julia and Rex are both characters in this book, and they're both characters in Brideshead. There's the element of the fact that he's drawn towards Catholicism by someone who's on her way out of Catholicism. And that's certainly something that sort of occurs in Brideshead Revisited. Any other reason that you were, sort of thinking of it in those terms, rather than as a campus novel?
Well, Brideshead sort of begins as a campus novel because it's set at Oxford, and
Right.
you're right. You're absolutely right. And in fact, I think you're the first reader to have pointed that out. That both of those names, Rex and Julia, are names of characters in Brideshead as well. And I was very taken, obviously, with Brideshead, though it's no longer my favorite novel by Waugh. It was for a time very important to me, and it was actually a novel I read before entering the church, and I do believe it had a deep impact on me, as it has had for many others. But I suppose really it's the idea of writing a story of conversion, that I really wanted to do that. And I should say that uh, Joshua Wren, the founder and editor of Wise Blood Books, worked with me for a long time on this book. And when it first came to him, it was really in a very different state than it is now. And he helped me a great deal to sort of work out this theme of conversion and pushed me really, I think, to tell that story and to make it the sort of the central, uh, even if maybe not overt, uh, guiding theme of the book, which is this young man's journey from a kind of uh, very, very loose cultural Protestantism uh, to, well, who knows? I mean, some people have said this is not a conversion story, and others have said, well, this is a this is a conversion story. But certainly, there's an encounter with the Catholic faith that occurs in the book, and where that's going to lead him ultimately, I think, is left a little bit unclear.
Right. Well, in Brideshead, the main bulk of the story, except for the sort of the World War II era part of the story, he never becomes Catholic in that part of the story. There's encounters with Catholics. There is encounters with the aesthetics of Catholicism. There's encounters with I don't know if he actually goes to a liturgy in Brideshead, but the character in your book does. Well, it's just interesting because I think of the scene at the end of Brideshead where he's in the chapel, and talking about that silent appeal from the tabernacle, and there's something similar in this book where the character is experiencing the liturgy. He's mystified by some of it. He's bored by some of it, but there's certain parts that stand out to him and attract him. And it's kind of amusing that he keeps thinking, yeah, I'm going to read all these theological books and really bone up on this stuff. And I don't know that he ever does actually in the course of your novel do that. But I think that's significant, because that's not really how Charles Ryder in Brideshead comes to it either. There's sort of gestures at him, asking a lot of skeptical, questions, but there's not really that serious of an intellectual engagement with the faith. It's more brought on by moral crisis, by his relationships, and by sort of these intuitive experiences of Catholicism.
I think, yeah, and clearly that scene at the end is just all about when Lord Marchmain crosses himself on his deathbed is. Well, it's very much. I mean, it's very much like a sort of a catechesis for Charles Ryder because he sees this happening and he is himself praying sort of an imitation of Julia, and then when we see him at the very end of the novel, in the scenes during the war, when he's leaving the chapel at Brideshead, and has just recited that newly learned ancient form of prayer,
Mm-hmm.
we have the sense that it's sort of a continuation of the scene at Lord Marchmain's deathbed, where, of course, you have the sign of the cross, which is which I don't believe he makes the sign of the cross when he's kneeling there, but he is kneeling next to Julia, and so there's a sense in which, as you're saying, like it's not that he read a whole bunch of books; it's that he actually was sort of drawn into the movements of the Catholic faith.
Right.
His body is sort of being schooled in these things, and then he's actually learned this prayer by the end, and so it's like a compressed catechesis. And I think there is something. I mean, we're really going down the wrong path here because I've been comparing myself to Waugh, which is sort of completely unjustified. But if you wanted to make the comparison, you could say that. That scene in which my main character Colin attends a mass, something funny happens to him. He's not Catholic, but he's going to mass with this friend of his, Julia, who is Catholic herself, but sort of clinging to the faith by her fingernails at this point. She's living through that typical freshman experience of sort of having your faith tested when you go away to college. But somebody comes up to them and says, "Well, will you bring the gifts up?" And he's very taken aback by this, almost as if, I'm not Catholic. How can I do this? And she
Mhm.
persuades him that it'll be okay, that they can do it. And so he does that. And I think that's sort of the key thing. He's actually sort of drawn into the liturgy. Um, and, uh, and that may be the aspect of that experience that's the most sort of, I don't know, transformative, if you want,
Mm.
or at least the most intriguing to him.
Uh,
And I should say, typically I would never uh, sort of reveal this, but that happened to me before I was Catholic. I went to mass with somebody, and uh, we were invited to bring out the gifts, and it was a very unusual and strange experience because I had no idea what I was doing, but there was something quite quite compelling about it.
hmm. So how did you get onto this idea of humiliation? Like, what role did this epigraph? Is that something that inspired you in writing the book? Is it something that you found later and sort of put on as an epigraph because you found it to be fitting? What got you onto this theme?
Yeah, I think it was reading spiritual writers and stumbling across the idea that humiliation could be a way to humility. That was very striking to me. I think I actually read an article by Helen Andrews about her experience of being uh, sort of on the receiving end of cancel culture, or sort of
I vaguely
publicly
remember that. Yeah.
publicly shamed. She had some.
Yes. Yeah. I sort of remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think she uses that phrase, and I guess maybe she was quoting St. Bernard as well, though I don't think she attributed it to anyone in particular. And that was very striking to me, and so it's kind of stuck with me. And then later, as I was thinking about epigraphs for the novel, um, I went back to it and sort of dug it up and figured out what the source was. Uh,
In your experience, you went to Yale, correct?
that's right.
Um, did you experience this sort of intense self-consciousness when you first went there? Is that something from your personal experience?
I'm sure I did, and I'm sure. I mean, I think what I so I'll tell you an experience that really uh, was important to me to understanding what I must have experienced at that time, because it can be difficult to sort of have a direct connection to your first person subjective experience of things uh, 15, 20 years in the past. But I went to a bachelor party, to a wine tasting with a bunch of people who I had been at school with. And I was in a car with several of them, and we started to talk. And I found myself slipping into this mode, this kind of super ironic um, mode of being and talking and joking. Uh, and I was kind of horrified. It was a little bit like an out of body experience to realize that this must have been how I always was when I was back in college, sort of keeping everything at a distance, hyper aware of the possibility that I might say something that would be regarded as foolish, and trying to make sure that there was always plausible deniability with everything that came out of my mouth. And I think that and then the experience in the present of, I mean, we can uh, different people feel these things to different degrees and in different social situations, but actually the a lot of the feelings that I attribute to my character Colin as a freshman in college are feelings that I've had since in other situations,
Hmm.
perilous social situations. Uh, so my sense was that somehow um, uh, this postmodern irony that was just typical of the 90s, the late 90s, the time that I was in college. Um, I did not understand this at the time, but looking back and having a couple of experiences where I sort of found myself slipping back into that mode, uh, I sort of was able to connect that with the experience of human respect and self-consciousness, and to realize, oh my gosh, postmodern irony was just it was a it was like the situation that we were all in, of being at a place without our parents, without any set rules, without any scripts, a whole bunch of us from different backgrounds being thrown together, and always some very scornful, sort of sophisticated people who are setting the tone. It really, postmodern irony just emerges naturally uh, in a setting like that. It's kind of um, it's a it's a way of being when you're not quite sure what your next move should be, and you're waiting for other people to let you know that what you're saying is okay.
I have to admit, I found some of my encounters with people who went to Ivy League school as frightening, and this isn't a criticism of them at all, but I I very quickly realized that it would be very bad for me to be around people who would get any possible obscure referential joke that I might make. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So I worked on a cruise ship playing piano a few years ago, and the only other person there who was remotely conservative or Christian was this Anglo-Catholic dude who went to Harvard Law and then had started starting a business, but then halfway through that decided to apply for a job playing piano on a cruise ship, even though he wasn't a professional musician, and got it. It's very, very interesting guy. Incredible. Is like probably the most socially skilled person I've ever met. But he would get any little joke I might make, certainly more educated than me. And I was like, it's probably not good for me to be around people who would get any obscure reference that I could make. And then, there's also a couple who, I think they both went to Yale, who they're pretty well known Catholic writers and very, very nice people. So that, again, this isn't a criticism of them, but I was at their apartment once in New York years ago, and the wife said to the husband, there was like a printer sitting on the floor, and she was like, "Dear, could you move that out of the way so it won't be a scandal on?" And I got the joke, and I was so happy with myself that I gotten the joke, and I got like really frightened. I was like, I can't be around these people. Not again, it's not a criticism of them at all, but like it would just be bad for me to be around people where like I was just getting that high that I got their joke, that like I've gotten enough by osmosis, even though I didn't go to those schools, that I can pick up on something occasionally. I don't know if you can relate to that at all, but
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I came from a very small town of 800 people on the coast of Maine, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. I realize that now. And in the summertime, it was sort of an exciting place. The population more than doubled, and there were concerts and a lot of people coming in from out of town. But needless to say, they're a very small place. And my first 2 years of college were very difficult because, sort of for precisely the reasons that you're talking about. You encounter people who sort of spoke multiple languages, and they had read Kafka and Samuel Beckett. And the worst part was that they sort of expected that you had also done that, or it seemed to me that you were expected to already have knowledge that you had never acquired. And it's that's a very tricky position to be in. Um, and I ultimately did have a good time in probably the latter 2 years of college. I really started to enjoy myself, found intellectual interests, and a group of friends where I felt more comfortable. But yeah, it was a tricky time, and it's sometimes the very people who are sort of setting a tone that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable are themselves deeply uncomfortable, and they just manage to, through no fault of their own, in a way, just because they're trying to cope themselves, sort of secrete this sense of unease and discomfort.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, I
and
mean, I'm not really an educated person, but I pick up enough by osmosis just by hanging around those
yeah,
interviewing those people and talking to them that you know there's this little part of me that really wants to be in the club.
yeah.
you know
The inner ring. Yeah, no, I hear you, and that's sort of what the book was about. Is that desire to be with the cool kids, to get all the inside jokes, and to have read everything. Uh,
Yeah, well, it's a good thing you mentioned Brideshead Revisited and not you know any other Catholic novel, because like I've only read like 5 Catholic novels.
well,
I
I'm
wouldn't
sure.
have had anything to say if you had said The Power and the Glory or
I'm
something.
sure that's not true, but yeah, Brideshead. It's interesting because I recently reread Brideshead with a book club that I belong to here. My wife and I are in a couples book club, and it was interesting reading the book for second time at an interval of about 10 years.
Hmm.
I actually didn't enjoy it as much as I had the first time. It,
Interesting.
it left me feeling a little bit melancholy, um, and I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the writing, and I love the novel. But I'm more and more convinced that Waugh's masterpiece is Sword of Honor, or maybe Helena, the novel that he
Right.
himself liked the best and that he used to read aloud to his kids. Uh, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But
Interesting. Yeah, I've only read Brideshead, and I read it after hearing all the hype, and I felt like it really lived up to
oh
the
yeah,
hype.
I mean
Uh,
it's a
you know,
masterpiece.
so it's my second favorite work of Catholic fiction next to The Lord of the Rings, which shows you, I mean, I think that's totally a legitimate choice, but at the same time, it might indicate the limitations of my, the scope of my reading. Um, but I mean, those are both pretty like mainstream or like obvious choices, one might say. But yeah, I mean, it's incredible, and I guess I have a couple of reservations about certain things, but overall, I think it's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, Brideshead. Well, no, I mean, far be it for me to to critique Brideshead, um, but yeah, it's an incredible novel. I mean, I love the. Um, I think it's often been interpreted as as a sort of recapitulation of the Platonic idea of the ladder of love, and I think that
Mm,
interpretation is really good. I
interesting.
love the beginning when Charles first visits Brideshead and he encounters that Baroque fountain, and he's drawing and painting, and he's sort of converted to the Baroque, and that's sort of the beginning of his conversion
Right.
to the church. It's sort of already happening without his even really quite realizing it. And then Sebastian becomes a sort of extension of that aesthetic sensibility, and and the technical term that Waugh uses for Sebastian and then also for Julia is the term forerunner. Each is a sort of forerunner or a type of the next, and then Julia becomes, of course, the forerunner, as she herself is aware that she's merely a forerunner for something, for a
Mm,
greater
right.
beauty and a greater good, which indeed proves to be true. And
Yeah.
so there is something, because I guess it's because there's in so many novels. I think this is typical of the novel as a genre in a way, and maybe it's more typical of the French novel, which I'm more familiar with. Uh, but there's a sense in which the main characters in novels, are often sort of they enter this world of illusion and deceit, and they get involved with people who are bad for them, and they strive to become members of clubs that seem to be rejecting them,
Right.
and then at the end of the novel, if they are to sort of make uh, some kind of progress, they have to reject the world somehow. And sort of this happens in Proust's great novel *In Search of Lost Time*, which would be my pick for the greatest novel of the 20th century, probably. Um, and it happens in so many 19th century French novels, Stendhal's *The Red and the Black*, uh, some of the novels of Balzac. Um, Flaubert's novel *Madame Bovary* ends with her suicide, obviously, but many people have pointed out that
I,
there's a
did, I didn't know that. You've
oh no,
spoiled
spoiler! Sorry.
it.
Well, I've saved you the trouble of maybe of reading it, but Flaubert had a kind of love-hate relationship with the world, right? He describes it with a kind of hateful love. He said his descriptions are just matchless in their beauty and their perfection and their
Hmm.
fidelity to reality, but there's also a kind of world-denying or world-negating uh, flavor or color to Flaubert's descriptions. And so the novel sometimes has this kind of um, world rejecting or world denying flavor to it. And it says that you have to pass through this sort of world of illusion, and then you can reject that, and then the novel ends. But Brideshead is unique in that instead of seeing the world as this kind of hall of mirrors that you have to find your way out of, the world becomes this sort of forest of symbols, as a or kind of these. It gives you these kind of these signs which are incomplete, but which are always sort of pointing beyond themselves to something that's a little bit better. But in themselves, they are already good. The Baroque fountain is already in a sense, it reflects the beauty of God and the beauty of the church. And the same is true of Sebastian, and then even more true of Julia, because
Right.
he again paints the fountain, but this time he's painting Julia, and so a human figure has entered the picture. And so I think that's one of the things that's so wonderful about Waugh's novel, and maybe about the British Catholic novel in general. I think the Lord of the Rings, and you've had some very interesting tweets about this, and I've discussed this with some other people. Is it the greatest work of literature of the 20th century? Is it the greatest work of art of the 20th century? It's very hard to compare that book to anything else, but I think you can compare it to Brideshead in a way, in that the characters sort of there's a sense in which you always feel that the world is good and that creation is good, and that you want to be in this world that Tolkien has created. It's not a world that you feel the characters should leave. It's a world that's radically threatened by evil, but it's not intrinsically corrupt the way, say, the aristocratic salons in Proust's novel sometimes seem to be, just to places of complete nothingness.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. So back to your novel, Minor Indignities. I'm much more confident in my ability to judge the depiction of sexuality in films on a moral level than I am in the written word. It's hard for me to be objective about it. Now, your novel deals with, as you mentioned, the hookup culture, things like that, and there are some sexual scenes in the book. Now, and I say this not as a criticism or a judgment of it, but I was uncomfortable with some of these things, and not in the sense that they were a near occasion of sin or anything, but just it's an uncomfortable experience reading. You kind of feel like you have to only half read it and sort of skim over it. So I'm saying that not as a criticism, but just sort of I'm always curious, how a writer approaches that, and how a Catholic writer approaches that sort of thing. Like what goes into your thinking, and sort of how detailed to get in those kinds of scenes, and sort of what purpose that serves. Because I can read Walker Percy, but I can't ask him. So this is why I'm bringing this up. It's I wanted to ask you sort of what goes into that decision making process.
Yeah, I think the moviegoer is probably, is sort of there's very little in there that would.
That's his most tasteful.
Yeah, I think so.
One. Yeah.
There's an aesthetic criterion that I think probably should be paramount for artists, and this is a point that O'Connor and Percy would make again and again.
Right.
And I think it's correct. If the aesthetic constraints are actually going to be more stringent in some ways than anything else.
Sure. Yeah.
And works of art really should never arouse extra aesthetic emotions. They shouldn't make you angry. They should, quite apart from the fact that they could be a scandal to people. That's an aesthetic flaw.
Yes.
At least that would be my sense. And so that
when you say extra aesthetic, because I think this is actually a really important point, and I don't want to just gloss over it. Like, extra aesthetic emotions, you're not saying that a story won't make you feel sad or something like that, but what exactly is the distinction that you're drawing there?
Yeah,
because you're going to feel emotions that in reading a work of fiction in particular that are identifiable emotions that we experience in real life, and yet they are bound up with the work of art itself. So when you say extra aesthetic, you're saying something that sort of escapes the work of art and it sort of takes over. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
I think so. I think something that sort of diverts you from the
attending to the work.
That's right, from the work itself, and becomes a kind of end in itself. And so you could see this even. To use another example, I've been on the plane and sort of seen somebody watching a cooking channel on one of those seatback screens, and you see the steak sort of sizzling there and the butter,
Hmm.
and there's a pornographic side to it. I mean, it's just too it is involving you too much in the possibility of tasting the flavor and eating this thing that's being shown on the screen. It's literally trying to arouse your your desire for food. And
Hmm.
advertisements often do this too. In the most vulgar sense, this would be advertisements for fast food. You see a burger sort of
Right.
seared in delicious sauce. Um, and so this is the aim there is to stimulate the body
Right.
um, and I think the aim in a work of art, even if say you are feeling a sense of sadness or even joy or some other emotion along with a character, the aim there is not primarily to arouse your emotions or to stimulate a kind of Skinnerian response in you, but to bring you close enough to the character that you can understand their interior life and
Hmm.
identify with them. So, anyway, yes.
Well, yeah, that's I'm. It's a very interesting question. It's a favorite theme of mine. This relationship of art and emotion, and I didn't think we were actually gonna go there and talking about the sexual aspects of the novel, but it's a great point, and it's something that I think a lot about with regard to music. I'm like very jealous about insisting that the purpose of music is not to make you feel certain emotions, and a lot of people would disagree with that. Um, and so I think the same can be true even of works of art that more directly deal with human subject matter than say a piece of instrumental music does. Like things that actually you're dealing with characters who are feeling emotion, so it might be emotion might be more proper to it in a sense, but still you have that. I think T.S. I remember reading something by T.S. Eliot where he talks about sort of the emotion evoked by certain parts of the Divine Comedy being like a properly artistic emotion, and that the intensity of the artistic emotion or the aesthetic emotion doesn't depend on the intensity of the human emotion being depicted in the scene.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, so I'd like to go back to music too because I think it's very interesting. I mean, I think that it's very clear to me in music that there are works of music that are intended to evoke emotions, and some of them do so very beautifully and intentionally, and they're successful.
Sure.
But it is also the case that um, you can hear a single plaintive note played on a violin and be filled with a kind of nostalgia and a deep emotion.
Hmm.
But actually, nothing has happened artistically, and there's no beautiful structure there. So I think I would tend to agree with you that certainly the purpose of music cannot be to arouse emotion. And there are other works of uh, perhaps even the greatest works of music um, that that probably arouse very little sort of throbbing emotion of the kind that
Yeah.
we associate with romanticism, and they're perfectly valid
Right.
works of art. But in literature, I agree with you. I mean, Aristotle, after all, is going to associate tragedy. I mean, he says the whole aim of tragedy, in a sense, is to arouse emotion and then to purge
Mm.
it. And
Right.
the novel is a genre unto itself. But there is a kind of catharsis that happens in many novels too. And in fact, when I was thinking about the structure of this novel, and these are really the questions that interest me the most, I was thinking of, I mean, Aristotle has so many deep lessons about structuring narrative, but you have to kind of increase intensity and and raise the pitch of the emotions to a certain point, to a kind of climax, and then let things fall off again, and then you sort of start to climb that
Mm.
mountain again. And the minor indignities is very much based on sort of three movements like that. The last one being the most intense and the one that takes the longest to build up. Uh, so, um, well, that seems to entirely contradict what I was saying earlier, and maybe it does. But just to go back to the question of representing sexuality in a work of literature, I
Mhm.
agree it's very difficult. And I showed this manuscript to a priest at one point, and he actually suggested that I take out some things that I had in the novel, and I did. Uh, and I did that in part because I think he was right, and that they were unnecessary and probably maybe morally uh, they didn't belong there. But I think aesthetically they didn't belong there too. If somebody can make a very strong case that a scene could cause scandal, I think that's a sign that there's an artistic problem too. Because I don't think that it's ever necessary for a work of art to cause scandal in anybody. Now, it could happen inadvertently, and this is something that Flannery O'Connor talks about in her essays. And I think the answer that's often given to this, and maybe she even gives it, is an answer that Mauriac gave, which is you have to purify the source. I think that's true. But I would also say that on the other side of things, I did leave in some scenes that, as you said, maybe they did make you a little bit uncomfortable, and I certainly hope that they were not an occasion of sin for anybody. I don't think they would be. I don't think that these scenes are like that. And there's a way of writing about
not a near occasion of sin. Yeah,
there's a way of writing about relations like this too. That I mean, the artist's intention is important, because if your intention, sexuality is a mirror of human relations, and there's a it's a domain of human existence, but it must be approached very delicately. But if you're going to represent a conversion realistically, you do need, you cannot you can't skim over parts of reality there that are essential to the protagonist's life as well. And so I felt that it was necessary to go into this aspect of college life, which, after all, is it's a very vexing and very difficult aspect of college life that
right.
we've all talked about, the hookup culture. It's a problem. It's a yeah.
All right, thanks. Yeah, that was very interesting. Okay, so I read a piece you wrote, changing subjects entirely. I read a piece you wrote about the Eric Romer, his prose fiction. We just discussed on our podcast, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, we just discussed his film, My Night at Maud's, with Matthew Schmitz about a month ago. And it was very interesting to read your essay, because I guess I hadn't realized or I had forgotten that these 6 Moral Tales films that he had made were based on stories that he had already written in prose. And so actually, I'm not sure which direction I want to go, but maybe I can ask you first, because clearly there's passages in this article from his fiction, from his novel, which hasn't yet been translated in full in English, that you translated yourself. So I wanted to ask about your relationship, because you mentioned French novels. What's your relationship with the French-speaking literary world?
Well, I lived in France for 6 years, and I have many friends there. My godfather is French. I have translated a number of books from French, and you could say that, oddly enough, Eric Romer was one of my first literary loves. I encountered one of his films just after college, and was immediately entranced by it. It was The Four Adventures of Renette and Mirabelle, and then watched A Summer's Tale, which is a beautiful film that is probably Romer's most personal and autobiographical film. I think he was certainly not one to make autobiographical films, but if there is one of his films that could be described as autobiographical, it might be that one. And so Romer has been a love of mine ever since, and I've watched his films again and again. And what I didn't know was that he had begun as a novelist and a fiction writer, and he came late to the cinema, and he was for several years an editor at the Cahiers du Cinéma, the French journal of film, which is still in existence. And he didn't really make a successful film until he was in his late 40s. I mean, commercially successful. Right. And one of the reasons for that is that he spent really, I guess, almost it could almost have been a decade trying to be a fiction writer. He published a novel with the leading French publishing house, Gallimard, and the novel was a complete failure. But he didn't give up. He then wrote a short story collection, which he submitted to the same publisher, and which was rejected. And it was only then, after that second failure that he began to turn in earnest to the cinema. So yeah, it's a fascinating trajectory, and helps to explain why he was about a decade older than many of the people he was making movies with, and working with at the Cahiers du Cinéma.
Speaking of which, this is your first novel, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And do you have any previous works of fiction published? Any short stories or anything like that?
Yes, in French, but not in
Oh,
English.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
very interesting.
so yeah, for a long time, since I guess probably for 10 years now, I've been a columnist for a French literary journal called the Atelier du Roman. So I write articles, and I published a few things there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Another change of topic. I gather you're a student of the thought of René Girard. This is, I never read him, except an essay that you sent me where he reviews Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which I would have never known existed, and it's very good. I guess that I've mainly encountered him as sort of like feeling like he's a fashionable name to drop, but not necessarily going or to invoke a certain idea of his on a relatively superficial level is the impression I get, not having read him. But I have the impression that he's often used that way. So since you're someone who has studied him more in depth, I'm just curious, sort of like where do you see him fitting in with the present day Catholic intellectual world, and what do you think? Where do you think his greatest relevance to our current situation lies?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer uh, briefly. But so Girard has become much more popular and much more current in the last, I would say, 2-3 years. It may have something to do with the pandemic. It certainly has something to do with the fact that a couple of books have been written about him, a couple of good books, one by Cynthia Haven, who wrote a biography of Girard called Evolution of Desire, and then one by Luke Burgess called Wanting, which was a sort of popularization of Girard's ideas, but very faithful to his ideas and very well done. And then there's also sort of a cultural critic named Jeff Schellenberger, who has taught some classes on Girard and written a number of articles on him for the Washington Examiner and Tablet Magazine. And I think, I single out those names in particular because I really think that they've been responsible for bringing Girard to some audiences outside of academia. And that may be one reason why he's just sort of popping up all of a sudden. Now, his relationship to Catholicism, so Girard was a Catholic convert. He was raised in the church. He fell away very early. He was probably 13 when he stopped going to church. He came to the US. He was kind of a typical left-wing intellectual. And then he started working on his first book about the European novel. And he was reading Dostoevsky and Proust and Cervantes and Flaubert. And as he was reading them, he happened upon this sort of common denominator that linked their novels, which was that the characters had a kind of second personality that they borrowed from some admired hero or model. And he sort of reflected on what was happening to these characters at the end of the novels, where they seemed to sort of reject that borrowed or sort of false self. And as he reflected on that pattern and the conclusions of these classics, he started to experience something similar in himself. And he underwent first an intellectual and aesthetic, and then soon after, when he had a scary brush with cancer, he felt that God was calling him back to the church, and he went back to the church in the course of writing this book. And so he became a sort of a kind of Catholic literary critic who then expanded his ideas into the fields of anthropology and especially religious anthropology. And he came up with this vast, ambitious theory of culture based around the scapegoat, the idea that the Christian Gospels have a structure that's identical to pagan myth, but that unlike pagan myth, in which, say, a character like Oedipus is portrayed as responsible for the outbreak of the plague and as a homicide and somebody who's committed incest, that the Gospels reveal that actually that account of things is just a diluted mob's version of what it's like to be in a crisis and to want to find some cause for it that can easily be eliminated.
Mm,
And so, in Girard's view, the Old Testament, but then in stories like the story of Joseph, but then especially the New Testament and in the accounts of the Passion, uh, uh, tell the truth about uh, human relations, and they are uh, the only true anthropology. They demystify mob violence, and they show how human relations work. And so that's Girard sort of, that's much too fast, but that's sort of Girard in a nutshell. And you can see how this would, in some ways, be very compatible with the Catholic faith. But there is, to my mind, there's some work that needs to be done to make Girard into a real doctor of the church. I think that was Bishop Barron's ambition, or his
mm,
sense that Girard might have that role one day. But I think Girard's anti-sacrificial um, position, especially in some of his early books, is, I think many Catholics recognize that there was some incompatibility there between
I
his
see.
ideas and the Catholic faith. Though it should be said, Girard himself uh, was the first signatory on a manifesto to request the return of the Latin Mass in France at the time of the motu proprio in 2007. He was a daily communicant by the end of his life, and so he was a Catholic through and through.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess I tend to be, I guess one of the reasons that I've sort of like not been sure what to make of him just reading about him secondhand is that it does seem like too grand of a cultural theory in some sense, and I'm always suspicious of those sorts of things. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, I mean, so I've got to say, so Girard was really, you know, he was so instrumental for me. And his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, about the European novel, was just one of my favorite books, and it played a huge role in my life. But I've also got to say, it was Flannery O'Connor and Mystery and Manners sort of saved me from Girard. I mean, sort of saved me from that abstract grand narrative that Girard uh, uh, painted, and which I think is brilliant. And I believe it. I believe it's probably true too, though I do think that there has to be some Catholic retrofitting there. But um, it, it can be it can be hard to be the disciple of somebody who has such a sweeping account of all of human history, because there's
Mhm.
the risk that you sort of float up there in the ether of his theory without having done the gritty groundwork that he had to do in order to construct it
Mm,
in the first place. And so you end up having a very sort of, um, yeah, sort of a very abstract intellectual life. And I think
I
Mystery
see.
and Manners and the work of actually creating literature was a good antidote to that.
Mm. Now, I've seen a couple of commentators on your novel say that it sort of instantiates, some ideas of Girard's. Is there anything to that?
Well, the Franco-Czech novelist Milan Kundera once did a radio interview with Girard, in which he said, "Well, if I had read your book on the novel before I wrote my early short stories, I would have had writer's block, because I would have thought, oh my gosh, you're just illustrating Girard's ideas, and I would have had the disagreeable sense of being a mere sort of follower." Well, I mean, uh, that's a real predicament. To be honest, I wasn't thinking too much about it as I was writing the novel, which sounds, I mean, that sounds completely uh, untrue, like it should be untrue, because I spent so many years studying Girard, and because so many people have noticed that there were uh, sort of Girardian relationships among the characters in the book. But what really helped me in writing the book to be released from that fear of feeling like a rank follower of Girard was some really starting to understand that Girard's ideas about um, the imitation of desire and competition and snobbery were um, getting at some of the same themes that crop up in Catholic spiritual writers uh, about pride.
Mm,
And understanding that actually, instead of Girard's sort of grand theory being the single lens through which all human relations must be understood, which was a kind of adolescent idea that I had at one time, that actually he was getting at something that was much more universal and much deeper. And if you reread Deceit, Desire in the novel in that light, you'll see that the word that he uses more often than any other is not mimetic desire or triangular desire, right? This is the concept that he's sort of most known for, but pride, romantic pride, the idea that um, somehow by rejecting God, we can forge this sort of perfectly autonomous, strong self that will be indestructible and can't be wounded. Um, and that's what he believes the great novelists were sort of critiquing that modern Promethean idea.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about your essay, The Situation of the Catholic Novelist. I read it. I enjoyed it. It was really interesting to see whenever, there's this is a genre of essay, right at this point. And it's always interesting to see what writers each person chooses to focus on, and there were some in here that I wasn't familiar with or who had been left out of other sort of accounts of the state of the Catholic novel or the recent past several decades of the Catholic novel. I have a very general question, though. So one of the useful things about this essay is that it lays out a number of different strategies that Catholic fiction writers have used to try to communicate with the secular world, or to not try to do so. And I have a very broad meta question, which is: doesn't the fiction writer basically, in the end, just have to use the voice that God gave him and largely forgo thinking about strategy?
Yes, I think that's true. I guess that I wrote this essay sort of with the idea that I could make a map for myself just to figure out what Catholic writers had done in the last 50 or 60 years in the US. And I was inspired by this very good essay by the British novelist Pierce Paul Reid called The Catholic Novelist in a Secular Society. And I thought that I would try to do what he had done for the British Catholic novel for the American Catholic novel. And so I actually read some novels that I not only hadn't read, but wasn't even familiar with in order to write this essay. And I do think I turned up a few things, uh, and but the question of strategy here is maybe more after the fact, a posteriori, in the sense that in looking at some of these novelists, like say Ron Hansen, or Protestant novelist Marilyn Robinson, or the Canadian novelist Randy Boyagoda, or Lee Ozer, or um, Christopher Beha, Phil Clay. There was a way that you could group some of them together in these sort of recognizable categories. The novelists who write about the sort of tend to write historical novels, or whose novels are set in the past, and sort of look back to a Catholic world where the church had a much greater role in our society than it does now. The novelists who sort of are writing about contemporary urban experience, or in the case of Phil Clay, wartime experience, but they they maybe don't really think of themselves entirely as Catholic novelists, or that's not their main intent, and they tend to invoke a kind of wider definition of the Catholic novel than maybe some Catholic novelists would be apt to, and they invoke a tradition of doubt and questioning. And then there's this comic tradition, which is probably the one that I end up defending, and which is represented by novelists like the German Martin Mosbach, or Randy Boyagoda, who's in the process of publishing this 3-part novel that's a kind of spiritual odyssey based on the structure of the Divine Comedy. And my sense, I'm very sympathetic to Mosbach's idea that the literary form of Catholicism is the comedy, and that somehow, because the Catholic worldview is founded on the reality of original sin, and and that sort of leads to a kind of comic view of life, in the sense that we may have these Promethean projects, but ultimately we are going to fail, and that failure is a kind of engine of comic possibilities.
Yeah. Well, so I do come to this sort of discussion from a musician's perspective to a certain point where I'm like, hey, you just have to play what you hear, and don't, you can't think about like, oh, how am I communicating with, X person. But it may be that fiction. I mean, Gilson in his book, sort of examining philosophical characteristics of all the different art forms, does not include the prose fiction in his Arts of the Beautiful, which is interesting. It may be that the novel is not an art of the beautiful primarily, and so it may be that there's more sort of not didacticism in the vulgar sense, but there is more of a didactic or a sort of at least a moral purpose to it than that would necessitate thinking about such things, necessitate thinking about one's audience in a particular sort of way, as Flannery O'Connor famously did with talking about shouting to for the deaf and drawing large colorful images for the blind. But I can't help but thinking of, I don't know if you've ever read Henri de Lubac's book Paradoxes of Faith.
No.
Well, there's a whole chapter. It's basically just a collection of aphorisms, essentially, or short little paragraph thoughts. But there's a whole section where he's talking about sort of the mania for adaptation and sort of like, oh, how can we communicate the faith to people? How can we adapt the faith to modern times? And he's like, first you have to figure out what it is, and so that's sort of how I feel about this question of like, oh, how do we communicate with X group of people, who should I be writing for? And I kind of feel like, isn't that just going to be sorted out by just writing the stories that you're given to write?
I think so. I mean, I think there is some truth to that, and maybe you could look at the essay as a kind of rationalization of a direction that I already intend to go. But well, listen, I think the question of audience is kind of critical. There's a structural problem, right? You really are thinking about publication, about the realities of your audience, and there are real sort of commercial and artistic risks to taking your work in certain directions. Pierce Paul Reed wrote a novel called The Death of a Pope, I think, sort of a thriller that involves a plot at the Vatican. And his agent told him that the book was simply too Catholic to be considered for publication in Britain. And Reed is a best-selling writer who publishes with one of the world's biggest publishing houses, typically. And obviously, Ignatius Press is a fantastic press, but he did sort of have to settle for placing the book with Ignatius because that was his only option. And so in his subsequent book, or one of his subsequent novels, Scarpia, which is a retelling of the opera Tosca and a very fine novel, he gets around this problem by setting his book in a period when the faith is just a part of the fabric of everyday life. And so it would have been unnatural for him not to have his characters having conversations with their confessor or going to a Catholic mass. And so there is, I basically agree with you. I ultimately, I don't think we can write the books that we're not supposed to write, and we have to write the ones that we're supposed to write. But
given knowing that, it's like, given you already know what you want to write, there's ways to adapt it and sort of to give it find a place for it in the world as maximally as possible.
I guess so. And it's interesting too. It's also just sort of it's a structural question. It's like today's Catholic writer. It's like somebody who shows up at a party where all of the guests are maybe speaking a language that he knows, but that he's only sort of just recently learned. And I mean, in other words, I'm trying to set the stage. Imagine a party at which you're a guest and you sort of know that you're a little bit of an outsider. So in the literary world, the literary establishment, I would say the Catholic writer, as a Catholic, somebody, a faithful Catholic, is in that position. And the tendency is either to try to conform entirely and to blend in and to pretend that you're not different at all, or to overemphasize that difference and to sort of make it into your identity. And the difficulty today is that O'Connor maybe had to shout, but when she shouted, there was somebody to listen, and I think what she was trying to say was getting through. It's not clear that shouting is the right approach today, and it's not clear that whispering is enough either. And so the question is, if you believe that there is something distinctive about the Catholic novel, and for the sake of writing that essay, I guess I sort of just adopted as an article of faith that was the case, and I tried to defend that point of view. But I'm also convinced that the Catholic novel is sort of more of a subset of the tradition of the Western novel more generally than it is something completely different from it. But if you think that there's something distinctive about it, then the question of how to embody that distinctiveness in a work of literature becomes very tricky in the current climate. And if you're writing for an audience of Catholics, you might go about it in one way. And if you're writing for a secular audience, you might go about it in a different way. And my goal or my thought was, well, how could you do it in such a way that everybody could find something there and get something out of it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Cool. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, Trevor, I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
Now, we spent some time the other night talking about music, just chatting online about music. You're knowledgeable about jazz. You also seem to be interested in film. So I wonder if you might be interested in coming on our film podcast at some point to discuss something.
Absolutely. It would be a pleasure.
Yeah. So we've been going through this Vatican film list from 1995. I don't know if you've ever taken a look at that. But
I'm not sure I have.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I'm not sure. But is this the list that has sort of like Babette's Feast and the Passion of Joan of Arc? And
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
maybe I have seen it.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll send you the list of the ones we haven't covered yet, and see if anything jumps out at you. But if not, then certainly we can do something off the list, maybe another Romer film or something like that. We're always looking for guests for that podcast because that's easily the most niche thing that we do in our little podcast network. And so it's sometimes hard to find people who are interested in those kinds of films who are, Orthodox Catholics who, have something interesting to say. You really have to go far beyond the realm of film critics, to find people.
Right.
So
yeah. That sounds like fun.
All right. Well, Trevor, this was fun. Again, people can get both The Situation of the Catholic Novelist as I think a $5 booklet from Wise Blood Books. And then the novel, Minor Indignities. It really is an enjoyable read. I was actually will be revisiting the Wise Blood catalog again fairly soon because I'll be talking to Katie Carl about her novel and also about Dappled Things, the publication that she edits. So people can look forward to that. But my next interview will be about the new book of unpublished notes by Tolkien, The Nature of Middle-earth, which came out last year. And I'll be speaking to the editor of that book, Carl Hostetter. It turns out that he is a Catholic. So Christopher Tolkien put the remaining material in good hands with him. I'll be interviewing him next week. All right, everybody, thank you for listening. If you've been watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you next time.